Welcome back to the studio. I'm Catherine and I'm going to show you how to paint this lovely kingfisher using watercolour. This is the reference photo we've used and we're going to firstly sketch it out by hand. This might seem a little bit scary if you're a beginner, but don't worry, I'm going to simplify it, so just draw along with me. So I've started at the bottom of the page and I'm going to put in the tree stump that he sat on first. I'm going to use a little bit of artistic license though, and I'm going to change it so that it looks like he's sitting on a branch. And what I'll do is I'll put the tail in so it looks like you can see it behind. So I'm just doing a quick sketch of a rough tree stump. It doesn't have to be perfect. Then I've just put a little rough guide of where I think his feet will sit. Now we're going to come to drawing the actual kingfisher. Break his body down into two shapes. So you can see I've drawn an ellipse for his body and a rectangle for his head. Using the basic shapes is going to give us a good guide so that we can draw in the actual shape of his body. So once I've got the two shapes in, I'm going to start with the beak just to get that in first. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. As long as we get the basic shape, he's going to look like a kingfisher. So I've continued around the top of the head and down the sides of the body. And I'm just continuing to do that using the shapes that we put in first as a guide to draw in the rest of his body shape. So at this point you can rub out the original shapes, and we're going to move on to putting in a little bit of the detail that's on his face. So he's got a couple of different areas of colour on his face. I've roughly put in where I think his eye is. And then I'm just following on from each section, drawing those shapes. If you don't feel confident enough to do a quick sketch by hand or by eye, you can always use a transfer method. Print out the picture on a piece of paper, and on the back of that cover it in pencil or graphite or pastel, and then you place it with the graphite side down onto the page you're going to be painting on, and then trace around the image. And the action of you tracing will put an imprint onto the page underneath, and you'll have a transferred image. So because I've put him on a little branch instead of this tree stump, I've had to sort of put in where I think his tail would be. So kingfishers have got quite a small stumpy tail. I've looked at other photos for this. So I've just popped his tail in on the bottom. I think we're just about done with the sketch. So I've just rubbed out any extra pencil lines that I'm not going to need. And if you've done your initial sketch too dark, then this is a good time for you to just rub it out so that we don't see any pencil lines come through when we start painting. So the next stage is to apply some masking fluid. What we're going to do is we're going to use the masking fluid to preserve the really light flecks in his feathers, and then afterwards we'll just do a light wash of whatever colour we want. So I'm concentrating on the flecks in his feathers on the top of his head. I will have put a little bit of a highlight on his eye, and I've just put a bit thicker area of masking fluid in on the white feathers, just so that we can preserve those parts and we don't need to worry about the paint running into them. There's also some highlights on his beak. And just for a little bit of texture, I'm going to put a bit of masking fluid on his chest. As you can see in the picture that some of those feathers look a bit ruffled and some of them are a little bit lighter. And talking of texture, I'm going to put quite a lot of masking fluid onto the tree stump to give that sort of bark effect. While we're letting the masking fluid dry, we can test out some of the colours that we're going to use. I like to take a scrap piece of watercolour paper and just test out the colours to see what they look like on the page and see what they look like together before we go ahead and start painting. The main colours in a Kingfisher are a nice reddy brown and a vivid electric blue. So I've just picked a few colours out of my palette to start testing. So I've gone with the reddy browns first. I've done cadmium orange, vermilion hue, light red and burnt sienna. I like to make a note of each one so then when it dries you've got a colour swatch to refer back to. Then I'm trying some blues and yellows. So I've gone with ultramarine blue, cobalt blue and cerulean blue. And then I've gone for lemon yellow, gamboge hue and cadmium yellow. These are colours I've used before and I quite like them, but it's handy if you are a beginner to do this sort of thing so that you can get more familiar with the colours in your palette. You might not have the same ones as me, so just do what you think is best. So I'm also going to add in this Viridian hue. It's quite a nice green and it'll be nice to test it by mixing it with some of the blues to see what colours we can get. Because although he might be blue, we want to put some different shades of greeny blue in. So I've just mixed a little bit of the Viridian and I'm going to test each blue. So firstly doing ultramarine, then the cobalt blue, and then the cerulean blue. So I've just mixed them. Just to see what they're going to look like mixed together. So now I'm going to do a little tester area and I'm going to mix all of the colours together. So I've put my water down, fresh water down first. Started with the cerulean blue because I think I'm going to choose that one. There's a little bit of the Viridian. They're quite nice colours together and they're quite vivid and light. So I've also added some ultramarine into it. And although I haven't tested it yet, this is the Payne's Grey, which I'm going to use to create the shadows. Payne's Grey's got a lovely blue tinge to it, so it's going to go really well with these blues and greens. So I'm going to add some of the brown colours now. So that was cadmium orange and the gamboge hue. So yeah, I'm happy with those colours and the way they look. So you can see I've ticked the ones I'm going to use. Once you've chosen your colours, get them all mixed up into your palette so you've got a good amount in the wells before you start painting. So my list is cadmium orange, vermilion hue, burnt sienna, ultramarine blue, cerulean blue, gamboge hue, viridian hue and Payne's Grey. So once you've got all your colours mixed, we're ready to start our painting. So I have decided I'm going to do this quite loose. So I'm going to be using the wet in wet technique a lot in this particular painting. If you're unfamiliar with this technique, I've got lots of other videos on the channel for you to check out which do go through this technique in detail. So I'm going to begin with the body, and I've put down some fresh water. I haven't put it down too evenly because I'd like to create an uneven wash or a variegated wash. Putting in the body but also a little bit of the background. So you can see I've put the fresh water on using our wet and wet technique. Put fresh water on first, and I've gone slightly over where the edge of his body is, and then use the cadmium orange just to drop a little bit of paint on there. Because it's the wet and wet technique, it's creating some lovely soft edges. So while that's still wet, I've just put some splatter onto the page. So I'm just putting some clean water onto the blue part of his head, and then quite loosely just put that cerulean blue onto his head but also over the edges to create a little bit of background. You don't have to be too careful with this. You can see I've just taken quite a lot of that off because I only want it to be light. And then again put some splatter in. If you start with a lighter layer of watercolour first, you can build up your colours once that layer is dry. So that's what we're going to do, and that's what's going to make the edges of his body later on. So all I'm doing now is just putting in a little bit of a background. You can do what you want really at this stage. I'm trying to make it look a little bit abstract by putting in some unusual brush strokes and a little bit of splatter. I like it when I do put the splatter onto the wet page because it will blend out. Okay, so while it's still wet, I'm just going to start to put in some darker paint. I'm using the burnt sienna and the cadmium orange just to put in some of the darker areas on the brown part of his red feathers. So now I'm going to just put in a little bit of blue. This is the cerulean blue for his shoulders, or just the tops of the wings that we can see. I'm just neatening up those edges because I don't want the blue to bleed too much into that orange. As you keep painting, you will have to keep an eye on that. So now I'm moving up onto his face. So I've just put in the blue section that's under his beak and on his cheeks, and I'm putting in a little bit more on the top of his head. Again, I'm not really putting any detail in, it's quite loose. And while the paint's still wet, you can allow each area to blend nicely into one another. So I've just popped that little bit of an orange accent which is around his eye, and it's blended nicely with the blue, but it hasn't mixed because we still want to see the orange and the blue separately. So I've just mixed up the Viridian Hue and the Ultramarine, and now it's a stronger mix, so there's less water on the brush. And what I'm doing is dropping it into the areas where there's shadow. So that part on the back of his head has got quite a lot of shadow, so I'm using the mix of Ultramarine Blue and Viridian Hue to put that shadow in. Just come back to the shoulders and pop a little bit more on there. You can see that they have started to bleed again, so I'm using a damp, clean brush just to tidy up those edges. That's called lifting. I'm doing a little bit of that on the top of his head now as well. So I'm just putting a little bit more detail in on his tail. Doesn't need to be too much, just needs to be a bit darker because it is underneath the bird and also behind that stump. So if the light was coming from the left hand side, that part of his tail would be quite dark, and the bit where his little feet are. She put some Payne's Grey into the bottom of that just to enhance that shadow on the bottom of his body. So I'm just defining the edges of his body with a little bit more of a stronger colour mix. So we're using less water and more paint. And I'm doing the same on his chest, just putting in a little bit of texture that actually would dry. And I think what we'll do is we'll let that dry completely before we do any more detail. Okay, so now that that's completely dry, we can safely work with a lot darker paint now to put in his eye and his beak, and it's not going to blend and spread into the nice blue and orange that we've put on. So all I've done is taken the Payne's Grey and filled in where his eye is, and also put a light layer of that on his beak. The beak's quite light on the top and a little bit darker underneath because of the shadow, so keep looking back at the reference photo. Because we put the masking fluid on there beforehand, it's going to have preserved all the nice white highlights on the beak, so you don't need to worry too much about how it looks. So I'm not putting any water down first this time, I'm just using the wet mix that we've got in the palette. I'm just putting in a little bit more detail, so I've just enhanced the shoulders the top of his wing and around where the white part is on his neck. I'm doing the same with the cadmium orange on his body and around his face. So actually what you're seeing me do there is lifting the paint. I feel like around his eye has gone a little bit too dark and it should be more orange. So I've just taken some clean water on the brush and reactivated the paint on the page and used the tissue to try and lift as much as I can. And it's worked. And then I've been able to just put a little bit of orange back in there and you can see it looks so much better already. It's quite handy to know how to lift the paint because it is really the only thing that's going to help you recover from small mistakes. Of course, I do cover all of these different techniques in the other tutorials on my channel. So I think the main part of the Kingfisher is now done, so I'm just going to move on to doing the tree stump. So I'm using the burnt sienna with a little bit of ultramarine blue mixed in, and it creates quite a nice warm grey, depending on the ratio of blue to burnt sienna. I don't want to put too much detail in on the stump because the focal point of this picture is obviously the Kingfisher. So I started with a bit of a wash of that grey mix, and then I've popped a little bit of burnt sienna straight from the pan onto the wet paper. So you don't have to be that accurate, just do some natural lines to create that tree stump and the tree branch that he's sitting on. And I'm just popping in a little bit of darker shadow. You could use your Payne's grey for that, or you could use the ultramarine blue. Just lifted a little bit of the paint on the tree stump just to give it a little bit of texture. And Kingfishers have quite red feet, so I've got the vermilion hue, quite a strong mix of it, and I've just popped that onto his feet. Again, I'm not putting too much detail in. So that's our painting pretty much finished. I've just put a little bit of extra splatter in to make more of the background. I've put a little bit more of a deeper shadow in on that right hand side of the trunk, which is underneath the bird, just to give a little bit more contrast. So I've used the Payne's grey for that one. And I'm just deepening the shadows on the right hand side of the bird as well. This is why it's good to layer from light to dark in watercolour. If I'd have gone this dark at the start and not liked it, or it hadn't have worked, I would have found it very difficult to go back. Okay, so I think that's the painting pretty much finished. What we need to do now is let it dry completely before we can remove the masking fluid. So once it's completely dry, just gently rub at where the masking fluid is and it will just peel off. So now's your chance to just enhance any little parts that you think don't look right after the masking fluid. Sometimes the edges of where the masking fluid was just need neatening up. So that's what I'm doing now. Just going around his eye again. And I'm just going to put a little bit of this, a really light wash of the cerulean blue onto the areas like the top of his head and his neck where that's not white on his feathers. It's just going to make it look like it's the light flecks on his feathers. And then all that's left to do is to sign it and let it dry, and there we have a Kingfisher in a very loose style of watercolour. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can keep up to date, and I'll see you in the next one.